of the Hungarian Europe Society, and I was a journalist, so I was still very active. The floor is yours, Eddie.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you very much. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers to invite me. I'm very happy to be here, to be back to Budapest. And even though the title of my presentation was The Special Path or Sonderweg of Central Eastern Europe within the European Union, having been sitting on the Warsaw-Budapest Express all the time, both on a professional and a practical level, I would rather like to focus on Hungary and Poland from two particular perspectives. One of them is Eurosceptic populism, and the other one is deterioration of rule of law. And both Poland and Hungary are leading in this charge, but there are harrowing like signs in Slovakia and Czech Republic as well, but I would like to focus on Poland and Hungary. So, starting with Eurosceptic populism, I would like to fine-tune the gap a little bit between the two phenomena, because while links between populism and Euroscepticism have been analyzed before with regards to Western Europe, I think its manifestation in Central Eastern Europe has been relatively understudied. So, having been mapping the local political discourse together with one of my colleagues from Munich Technical University, Robert Csehy, we've been trying to map and identify the key trends when it comes to the political discourse in Poland and Hungary that is showing a very strong anti-imperialist theme that prevails in this populist framing of Euroscepticism in Hungary and Poland. So what we have seen is, in the last couple of years, that it's been Viktor Orbán who was leading the charge in this regard. He's been Eurosceptic in a sense that he not only questioned the institutional trajectory of deeper integration, but he disputed common EU policies, and most importantly, he employed a very harsh anti-Brussels rhetoric, launched campaign embedded in a broader conspiracy theory, meaning that George Soros, together with the European Union's institutions, trying to undermine the will of the Hungarian people. So why is it potentially destructive towards the EU? It's potentially destructive because it's because of this very strong populist element that Orbán just employed within the discourse, that he identified the EU with the corrupt elite and contrasted it with the pure Hungarian people, whom he and only his government is able to represent. And even more importantly, this antagonism mirrors a nationalist and anti-imperialist struggle between the Hungarian nation and Brussels, together with the decadent West that is, on one hand, harboring colonial sentiments towards Central Eastern European countries, on the other hand, not able to protect the Hungarian society from external threats. Meanwhile, his Eurosceptic populism became extremely one-dimensional, speaking that he merged his criticism into one pro-migrant federalist group, speaking that this is unlikely to change in the run-up to the EP elections, and I assume that this is going to be even harsher if, at a certain point, Fidesz is going to be expelled or just simply leave the European People's Party. Speaking of Jarosław Kaczyński and Poland, Jarosław Kaczyński has also developed a very harsh anti-Eurosceptic populist narrative, and as the rule of law based criticism has intensified towards Poland, he started to link the domestic corrupt elite with that of the EU. He also likened the EU to colonizing power that charged an attack against the Polish people. Also, the migration crisis allowed him to contrast Poland with the EU more clearly, and he increasingly emphasized identity and values in his Eurosceptic discourse. He also very often depicts Western Europe, especially Germany, that dominate the EU as being immoral given their exploitative colonialist past. So similarly to Orbán, he intensified his crucial cultural counter-revolution against the EU that is not able to defend the Christian values, traditional family values, as it continuously insists on political correctness for the sake of LGBTQ issues and Muslim minorities. But speaking of the systemic differences between the two political discourse, because I think it's also important to emphasize these differences, there are a few. So first, the Viktor Orban narrative is much more outspoken and pointed, which is partly due to the level of huge political centralization in Hungary. And given the fact that Kaczynski is part of a much more multiplayer political system, having distinct like members of the cabinet, such as Mateusz Morawiecki, who's trying to show a different face towards Brussels, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs, playing this kind of, serving as a kind of good cop, bad cop at the European level. And contrary to Orban, Kaczynski's party did not enjoy the same protection on the European level, speaking of the very strong protective shield of the European People's Party, which Orban enjoyed, and which has likely have been contributing to the party leader's more moderate tone. And while Brussels is equally being depicted as a collaborative with the domestic opposition, I think this is even more prominent in Poland, where there is potential capability of the oppositional parties to join forces. What we have seen is that this has just happened before the EP elections. And more importantly, the role of Donald Tusk within the European Council is another contributing factor. And also different party system structures, which I just mentioned, that's strongly related to the opposition being potentially able to cooperate. And thirdly, the third systemic difference is that Orban is mainly channeling his Euroscepticism through pro-wise versus anti-migrant discourse, which is also being criticized by Jarosław Kaczynski. But I think he's more critical in the context of the debate of deterioration of the rule of law and the criticism towards Poland. That's what I wanted to mention about Eurosceptic populism. And speaking of the deterioration of the rule of law, which absolutely captured the trend in Central Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and Hungary. Speaking of Poland, I think that the PS government has been absolutely overperforming like Orban's government in terms of the judiciary overhaul, and despite the fact that the Polish government made a decision to respect the European Court of Justice decision recently, PS government is still willing to complete the judiciary reform, and one of the most indicative decision of the government was that the creation of additional chambers within the Supreme Court. This kind of disciplinary body is usually investigates judges that are active in the field of defending the rule of law, among others by like educational actions and discussing these issues with citizens. And as a response, and it's very important, and I would like to highlight it later on when I'll just talk about the constraining role of the European institutions. As a response, the European Commission has launched an infringement procedure regarding the new disciplinary regime for judges. And speaking of Viktor Orban's competitive authoritarian regime, I think in the last 8 years the main question was whether there is going to be ever a consolidating point when the regime will shift towards consolidation, and we have seen that this is not going to happen. The Hungarian competitive regime has just entered a new authoritarian phase where there are less and less, even less space to maneuver for civic society organizations, and also the space to maneuver for the oppositional parties has been restricted further. It's just enough to see what's happened to the State Audit Office that is trying to undermine oppositional parties financially. So the political playing field is even more uneven than it has been before. Not to mention the fact how the independence of the Academy of Science has been undermined recently, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into details because I'm sure all of you are aware of what has been happening in Hungary in the last couple of years. But speaking of the constraining role of the EU institutions, first, I think we would need to, I would need to emphasize what are the most important contributing factors that are providing a very hospitable environment for authoritarian system building efforts within the EU. And I would like to highlight two based on the study of Daniel Kahneman. One of the most important contributing factors, as it has been said before during the discussions, is party politics, that there are huge incentives for European parties to try to keep these authoritarian leaderships within the party tent. Fidesz is most likely would be able to provide the third biggest national delegation within the European People's Party. And even though I believe that this suspension of Fidesz recently has been a considerable defeat for Viktor Orbán, he could still avoid the worst-case scenario, which was the expulsion. I think we can also discuss and talk about how effective suspension is, given that there was an extremely interesting presentation about Slovakia before our panel, how inefficient was in terms of the Smer party, which has been also suspended a couple of years ago. And we can see that the trends in Slovakia are not better, but getting even worse. But speaking of the EPP itself, I think it remains to be seen whether the party has just taken seriously that they would like to defend European values and they would like to actually do something about Viktor Orbán. I think it depends on the upcoming month whether this is going to be taken in action or they're just trying to maintain the status quo somehow, which would provide Viktor Orbán further space to complete his authoritarian competitive regime even further. And the second contributing factor is it's economic and it's basically about foreign direct investment. And as long as foreign direct investment is not declining when it comes to Hungary, but it's increasing, and this is exactly what we have seen in the last couple of years, it also creates a quite hospitable environment for the long-term sustainability of the Orbán regime. We're talking about mainly German and international companies that are accounting for 1/3 of the jobs in the private sector and more than 80% of the export in general, which is a huge contribution and very important. Not to mention the huge amount of EU funds that Hungary receives. Just to give you two numbers, between 2006 and 2014, the GDP growth has been 4.8% in Hungary, and without EU funds, it would have been considerably lower, 1.8%. So I think it's quite telling in terms of how important mainly the German companies when it comes to system building efforts and intentions. So when it comes to the approach of CDU-CSU, I think this played a huge role as well. German economic interests, which is being served by the Hungarian government loyally in the last couple of years. Just think about the slave law, but there were many other examples. So, and the third, which just came to my mind, but it has been demonstrated very correctly and precisely during the first presentation today, is that between 1990 and 2012, more than 12 million people have left Central Eastern Europe, which is, I think, the safety valve when it comes to authoritarian system building intentions, because those who are unsatisfied with the system, they can simply leave the country and try to find a way to live elsewhere. So I think this is also a contributing factor and important to mention. What is the systemic risk is that we are talking about an ever-expanding club, authoritarian club within the European Union. So it's not only about Poland and Hungary, but it's also about the rest of the Visegrad countries. Furthermore, it's also about Malta, Bulgaria, and Romania. And in order to avoid an irreversible proliferation of authoritarian hybrid regimes and models, the EU institutions would have to enforce multiple tools in a systemic and efficient manner. And I'm very happy to talk about my practical recommendations, maybe during the debate, so that I'm not going to abuse my time and give the floor to